So I want to talk about a completely different aspect of working with data from human participants. I'm going to talk about how we have developed a workflow to kind of try and make ethics and deposit and sharing of that data work together, so that we don't find problems from one knock on to the other. So just a very brief overview of our service provision at the University of Glasgow. There are sort of 3 specialists in the research data management team, providing about 2.8 FTE for the University of Glasgow, and we advise on general research data management issues. So we provide a grant application advice and support service. So we will review data management plans for grant applications and for other purposes, and we'll provide advice on costing RDM activities into awards. We also run our institutional data repository, Enlightened Research Data. That provides a safe storage platform for research data for the longer term. It's also usable as a sharing platform. In addition, we can use the data registry that sits on Enlightened to register data sets that sit in other repositories worldwide. And we provide a lot of advice and training to our academics, from the undergrad right through to professorial level. We don't really discriminate against in who can access our services. But today I really just want to talk about the processes we have around Enlightened research data. So this is just an overview of our systems. So these are the Enlightened repositories that we have at Glasgow. We have Enlightened research data, which is backed up with storage from Archivum at the moment. We have Enlightened publications, which is our publications repository, and we have Enlightened theses. All of these run on the ePrints software platform, and we have them fairly well connected up. So we have a research system that can talk to our HR system and our student system, and all of these systems will also talk to the Enlightened repositories. So we can pull through information about who an author is, whether they have an ORCID, what funding was associated with the research. I think that's probably the main things we pull through, because we also pull information from the finance system. And this makes for richer metadata in the records associated with the deposits. In addition to this connectedness, all 3 of these repositories push out to our staff profile pages. So when researchers deposit a paper or a data set in one of our repositories, the next day after it goes live, there will be that data set or paper will be listed on their staff profile pages. And our analysis of the university web pages shows that most people looking for outputs from staff look for these via the staff profile pages. They don't go to our repositories and look for data there. They look via the staff profile pages and expect to find that data linked. So this is how we work it. However, these lovely interlinked systems leave 2 important systems from our point of view out in the cold. So the ethics system sits completely separate from all of these systems, as does our data protection work. We were hoping that our new research system might roll some of these into our interlinked systems, but that has not been possible due to data protection issues, ironically. So as a service, we've had to find ways to kind of make sure that when we're depositing data, especially data that comes from human participants, we're doing so in a way that takes the ethics and the data protection into account. So when we started up Enlightened research data, we developed some basic deposit requirements for a data set. And our basic deposit requirements were the essential metadata that were required at that time by DataCite in order to mint a DOI. So that was title, creators, data type, publisher, and date. We also required at least one overarching README file that gives some contextual information about the data, and at least one data file. Now, almost immediately, it occurred to us that this wasn't really going to be enough when data came from researchers that were working on projects that required ethical approval. So we also very early on started asking researchers if they'd required ethical approval for their work, and if so, did they have permission to deposit. On top of this sort of basic metadata that we absolutely have to have, we have a kind of more recommended deposit requirements, which are richer metadata. So that funder information that we can pull from our research system, a contact address for the data set, just in case people have questions. We like to gather information either about the collection period, the period over which the data is collected, or the temporal period over which the data relates to, if it's more historically related data. We collect information about the resource language in which the resource language that the data represents, because there's quite a lot of research at Glasgow that's done in South America, for example, and it's being done in Spanish as a routine. And we would like ideally a collection description to give, again, a little bit of high-level contextual information about the data. If the data is being deposited in zipped up folders in order to preserve a structure, we prefer to have folder level README files in addition to the overarching README file, so that people can understand what the information is in each folder and how to use it. And we also encourage researchers to deposit other appropriate documentation if they have that. And then if there are human participants involved in the work, we ask now for a little bit more ethics information. So we ask for the application or approval number for the ethics application. We ask which committee granted that approval, because we have at Glasgow a university ethics committee, we have 4 college level ethics committees, and we have countless school level ethics committees. So we need to know which committee gave approval, just in case we need to go back to them in the future. And we also ask if there's any special requirements around that data that have been imposed by ethics. For example, a demand that the data will be deleted in a shorter time frame than we would normally accept with our standard retention period. We also started asking for a copy of the consent form and the participant information sheet. Ideally, we'd like to deposit these in the record as a reference and as a resource to other people, but as a minimum, our service needs to see it. And the reason we do that is we realized quite quickly that people thought that they had permission to deposit, or they thought it would be okay, but when we checked through their ethics paperwork, we found that they'd promised their researchers that all the data would be kept confidential, or the data would not be retained beyond the end of the project, or that there was no consent for data sharing. So we like to check this just to make sure. In some cases where the projects were relatively simple and there were a small number of participants, ethics committees would give the researcher permission to go back to the participants and reconsent them for data deposit and sharing. In other cases, we just had to acknowledge that the data was never going to be shareable and just deposit it as a dark deposit for long-term research integrity purposes. Or sometimes we even had to accept that the data was not going to be depositable because of the conditions in the ethics paperwork. Now, we had hoped that this would be a time-limited issue. We started taking deposits in the institutional repository right at the start when our service got going back in 2014. And at the same time, we started working with ethics committees to make sure that ethics processes were aligned with the need to deposit data and potentially share data with other users in the future. So we hope that within 3 or 4 years of getting the ethics committees up to speed with this, that all ethics paperwork would be in line with a requirement to deposit and share data. We may have been slightly naive hoping this. This is still not the case. So what we are finding now is that we still see today examples of ethics consent forms and participant information sheets that have contradictory clauses and also don't meet the requirements for deposit and sharing. Oh, sorry, jumping ahead. Before I go on to that, I just want to show how these different types of documentation appear in our repository. So these are two examples of data deposits in Enlightened research data. In this first one, the data itself is not publicly available. In this case, there needed to be an application process associated with getting access to the data. However, anyone that's interested in this data can read the master README document, which will outline what kinds of data are available. They can also look at the consent form and the participant information sheet to understand the terms on which that data has been collected and what the participants expect in terms of reuse. In the second data set, the data is openly available for reuse, but again, we have the README document that will give contextual information about this data and the consent form and the information sheet as documentation so that the researcher, any reusers can see the terms of the original data collection. Sometimes we also have other examples of documentation available. Those could be, for example, the questionnaire document that participants responded to, or the structure pro forma for a semi-structured interview, for example. Okay. So as time's gone on, as I said, we hoped that we wouldn't see these, but these are both examples from consent documentation that we saw this year. Or sorry, this one's this year, this one's 2020. In this first one, these sentences are harvested from both the consent form and the participant information sheet. So first of all, participants are told that all information that will be collected will be kept strictly confidential and will only be identified via a randomly assigned ID number. We queried, if all information that's collected will be kept strictly confidential, how does the researcher expect to publish their research? Then in the same document, it said all data will be anonymized and stored on a password protected platform as per the University of Glasgow guidelines. Again, we're not quite sure what these guidelines are. And then in the participant information sheet, the participants were told that personal demographic information and data obtained from the survey will be securely stored on a password protected laptop or server until the completion of the study and will be only accessed by the student and the supervisor. Again, how do they plan to publish this work? After September 2020, the data will then be stored with a data controller at the University of Glasgow, where it will have restricted access for up to 10 years. So this one's, it's just not great. It's not clear to us, so it's presumably not clear to the participants what information will be confidential, how the information will be used, how it will be stored, what will be deleted and when. The second example, these were two consecutive clauses from the same consent form. So the participants were told that the material will be destroyed once the project is completed and that the material will be retained in secure storage for use in future academic research. These were right next to each other and the ethics committee didn't spot the contradiction here. So this is why we continue to always collect and check these, the project paperwork when we get data through for deposit, just to make sure that the deposit is acceptable to the participants and what the participants signed up to, and that sharing is permitted. We also collect examples of these up and send them back to the ethics committees that approve them, pointing out the inconsistencies, because we really would like to see this process improved. Okay. So to try and head this off at a much earlier stage in the process, because obviously by the time we get to data deposit, it's far too late normally to do anything about this, we have worked with the University Ethics Committee and with the University Data Protection Service to develop a project initiation workflow for research that involves personal data. So this is available on our university publications and repository. It's available to anyone that wants to have a look at it. I would imagine it can be quite easily adapted if you wanted to use it at your own institutions, and we've licensed it CC BY, so feel free to take it. So far, well, this is actually not up to date now because I haven't checked it recently, but the last time I spoke about this, it already had 174 downloads and sort of almost 650 page views. So this is a very simplified version of the workflow that we have printed on a postcard that we hope to drop into lots of different departments once the university starts to open up again. Basically, there's 3 steps. First of all, write a data management plan to plan what you want to do with your data while satisfying the university and funder requirements. Then complete the appropriate data protection paperwork to establish what you're legally allowed to do with your data, and then seek ethical approval for all the planned uses of your data. So 3 steps can be broken down into a very simple workflow here. Write a data management plan, complete a DPIA, then use the checklists and the information risk classification that's available on the university's web pages to determine the risk level. Our data protection office are very under-resourced and only want to see a DPIA if there's high-risk data processing involved, but they do recommend that everybody has one just in case. And also, if it's identified that the data needs to be shared out with the university, then we'll need data sharing agreements arranged with the contracts team. Then you can progress to modify a privacy notice and then apply for ethical approval. And the second part of the document is a much more complex version of this. Now, we don't distribute this just on postcards. We don't want to put people off. However, this version of the document has links to all the different other documents that are required to complete the process. It's got information in it about the timeframes that you might require for certain parts of the process, and links to the service email addresses that can provide feedback and guidance on the process. We found it's quite easily adjustable. We've had to tweak it a couple of times as data protection have changed different requirements at the university, easily adjustable to accommodate new procedures. And the researchers that we've spoken to about this like it because it gives them a clear path through these processes. When GDPR first came in 2018, a lot of researchers didn't engage with it at all because they found it too intimidating, too big, and they just didn't know where to start. So we've found that giving them this sort of stepwise process through data management planning, GDPR, and ethics makes it much more approachable and achievable for them. And we're hoping in a year or two where this sort of percolates through the system that the ethics paperwork that we see at that point will be much better and much more supportive of both data deposit and data sharing. Okay, thank you.